Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily interview show about the United States. Hello, everybody. A couple of months ago in December of 2025, we did a show on homelessness in America. We've done a number of shows, actually, lots of interesting books on this very troubling subject. This one was with an East Coast homelessness activist, Patrick Markey, wrote a book called Placeless, Homelessness in the New Gilded Age. Markey suggested that 2% of Americans are homeless. It depends, I guess, how you define homeless. It doesn't necessarily mean on the street. It might mean sleeping on someone's couch. Anyway, when it comes to homelessness in the new Gilded Age, there's no better stage, or perhaps worse stage, for this in the new Gilded Age than where I am in San Francisco in the Bay Area. And there's a new book out today. It's called Anti-Eviction, the Fight Against Tech-Led Gentrification in San Francisco. It's by my guest, Manissa Maharawal. She teaches anthropology at American University in Washington, D.C., where she's joining us. Manissa, congratulations on the new book.
Thank you.
Before we start on your anti-eviction movement, which your book focuses on, perhaps you might tell us your interpretation, at least, of what's happened in the Bay Area. Your website has an interesting map of the Bay Area where I live, so I'm very familiar with the map, both San Francisco and the East Bay, laying out what you see as a kind of colonization by the tech community of the Bay Area. Is that a fair way of putting it?
You know, so anyway, thank you for having me to start, but I got the colonization metaphor directly from activists who are fighting against gentrification. So, and I kind of took that metaphor in that article that you showed and tried to think with them, like, what would it mean if we actually thought about this as a colonization? And in what ways does the tech industry, especially in the, 2010s, which is the period I was writing about and am writing about in my book and in that article, in what ways did they sort of act as a colonizing settler colonial force on the Bay Area? You're in the Bay Area, so you remember the 2010s, the tech boom of, overnight Twitter millionaires and, Uber and the sharing economy. And what I really am focusing on in the book and in the article you showed is sort of the other side of that tech boom. What was that like for working people, poor people, people not in the tech industry? And the colonization metaphor really emerged mostly from, the Latinx community in San Francisco, who sort of said, like, we think of these, Google buses rolling down our streets and the mission as sort of a conquistador transportation coming through, right? Like, only, these huge buses that are only for some people and not for other people, stopping at our bus stops, only letting in, young white people, and we're standing there with our kids. So that was the sort of metaphor I was building on.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I mean, I guess I'm perhaps, for better or worse, an example of that colonizing force. I used to live in the East Bay. Now I live in San Francisco. And as it happens, my wife works for Google. She doesn't take the Google bus, but I know your book focuses on the bus blockades of 2013 to 2018. Manissa, some people might say, well, this is not colonization, it's just the market. The Bay Area, again, is the center of tech, Silicon Valley, from the dot-com boom of the 1990s to the AI boom today. Everybody's free to come and leave as they choose, and that naturally drives up rents and the prices of real estate. Is that a credible argument?
The argument that it's just the market?
Well, that San Francisco is sure, it's an expensive place and people have been driven out, as they have, of Manhattan, perhaps even downtown Washington, D.C., where you live. But that's
Mhm.
just the market. I mean, I guess in a sense it's neoliberalism.
Mhm.
But that's how the world works in a free market economy. Land in cities like San Francisco, New York, Washington, D.C. is increasingly scarce and therefore increasingly expensive.
Yeah, I mean, it is how the market works, right? But what, I'm trying to show in my book is that we don't have to accept it as inevitable, right? We don't People who are living in San Francisco at this time, who'd been living there for years and years, mostly in the book, people who are living in rent-controlled apartments, so they had a sense of stability, right? That, okay, even if the market is gonna drive up the price of housing in the city, I still have some stability because I have a rent controlled place to live, right? What happens in San Francisco during this tech boom in the 2010s is that sort of sense of stability for lower income people who were trying to, find a way to really stay in a place that was rapidly becoming too expensive around them, right? Because of the market, like you said, that stability was pulled out from under them, right? Through the Ellis Act, through sort of like the tactics of landlords, right? People were being evicted anyway. And so I guess what I'm trying to show is that how do we, in these rapidly, becoming expensive, inaffordable places, right? In the context of sort of a nationwide housing crisis, how do people find ways to stay in their homes? How do they disrupt that gentrification, that the market can just sort of like force us out of our homes, based on its whims, right? Or not its whims, but structures of private investment, right? And real estate. So I guess the book is trying to argue that we have to think about this not as inevitable, right? That there are ways to contest it. Things could be different, right?
Yeah, and as it happens, today we also ran an interview with a former teacher of yours, Ida
Yes.
Sasser, who has a new book out called The Yellow Vests and the Battle for Democracy. And it's about I don't know if it's the revolution, certainly the rebellion of the Yellow Vests, of provincial French people, the kind of people, I guess, who have been forced out of the San Francisco market, school teachers,
Mhm.
police people, people who worked in middle class or lower middle class jobs who can no longer afford the city. So this, Manissa, for better or worse, I mean, this is we're on the front lines of neoliberalism here, and the neoliberal economy of formerly middle class people who had historically lived in places like San Francisco,
Mhm.
being able to afford rent controlled places, now being driven out. As you know, there's a huge debate out here about this. A lot of people on the left, some more conservative people. Someone wrote a book called San Francisco, which suggested that any kind of attempt by the authorities to address homelessness and the housing crisis, the scarcity of housing in San Francisco, have only compounded the problem. In your analysis, is the local government, particularly San Francisco local government, is it part of the problem? Has it been addressed? Has there been any attempt in your analysis to address this problem, either of San Francisco government, East Bay governments, Oakland, Berkeley, and elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. So the first thing is that the city government and the state government in California has been attempting to address the housing crisis since the 2010s. And that's one of the things that the activists I worked with for my book really do view as a success is the way that they, when they told me that when they started doing the activism, either whether Google bus blockades or eviction demonstrations, people were not talking about a housing crisis in San Francisco, right? And that at 10 years later, 5 years later, there was an acknowledgement that there was a housing crisis. The decision about what to do about it, right, is really contentious. Um, so, what I sort of lay out is the policies or the, ideas that activists had in San Francisco, ranging from fund the community land trust, right? One of the characters I talk about in my book eventually wins the right to stay in his apartment, and they move his apartment into a community land trust, into the San Francisco Community Land Trust. And so now his unit is permanently affordable, right? So even when he leaves it, and I think he'll probably be there till for the rest of his life, it will still be affordable, right, for someone. And so that's one of the policy measures that activists really were pushing for, like fund the land trust more, right? Make sure that there aren't loopholes in rent control so we can maintain the affordable units, the low-income units we already have, right? Just last month in Sacramento, there was another proposal to cap rents in California, across California, and to get rid of the exemption on single-family homes, right, for basically rent control. And it didn't go through. It didn't make it out of committee, right? And so these are some of the ideas that activists have really been pushing for, right? Like there's simple solutions to this. If there's statewide rent control where you can't increase rent more than 10%, a year, all of a sudden people are spending less of their income every year on rent, right? One of the problems is that rents go up a lot faster than our wages do, right? There's been wage stagnation, but housing prices have increased like hugely out of proportion with our wages, right? And so I'm not making 10% more every year, but my rent goes up 10% more every year, right? And so, sort of a rent cap proposal that doesn't make it out of committee in a Democratic-led state, right? To me, that's like very troubling, right?
It's rent control, though. Again, you know this better than I do. It's a complicated question. I mean, in a way, you're absolutely right. Of course, it should be controlled so that people can't be thrown out of their homes. On the other hand, it impacts homeowners, and it also creates this class of people who live in a place their whole life. There are lots of examples of these, for example, in Manhattan, of people who actually earn a lot of money and live in rent-controlled places. Is rent control for you really the heart of the issue when it comes to fixing this problem?
I don't know if it's the heart of the issue, but I always sort of start with rent control when I talk about this, because in some ways it's such an easy policy, right? It's like we can just cap the amount we charge for rent. And all of a sudden, lots of people are saving a lot more money than they were before, right? Going to have to spend on rent. And it's been shown to work, right? Rent stabilization in New York City, where I'm from. I grew up in a rent stabilized apartment in New York City, not a rent controlled apartment. So stabilization and control are different in New York, but a rent stabilized apartment in New York City. And it's the reason, why my family was able to stay in New York. So I guess in that sense, it's very personal for me. But, rent stabilization doesn't just stabilize rents, it stabilizes people's lives, right? It gives them a chance to imagine a future someplace that they wouldn't be able to imagine otherwise, right? And what we've seen in the US over the past, again, since the 2010s, really post the 2008 housing bust, is that more and more housing is owned by private equity and investment, right? And so the sort of like foil for rent control is always the small landlord whose expenses are going up, and they need to raise rent to cover those expenses, when the reality of the housing crisis in the past 15 years in this country is that private equity and investment firms are hugely profiting off of rental housing, right? And billions of dollars profiting off of rental housing, right? And so rent control would be taking money from them more than anyone else at this point, right? But is it the core of the issue is a good question. I think it is a good fix, and it's something I talk about because it's one of the things that housing activists in San Francisco who I worked with always talked about, right? But I think there's other pieces of the puzzle for sure.
Is there and we can get to that. Minister, is there a split, shall we say, on the left between activists like yourself and then more moderate, mainstream, perhaps pro-market Democrats like Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson in their book Abundance? They really address the issue of housing centrally. Klein himself is from California. He writes extensively about the state in the book. What do you make of the Klein-Thompson argument in Abundance about simply addressing this issue, not just of homelessness, but of the lack of affordability of cities by building more homes? And it's not just going to come through the state, but through private investment as well. You seem to indicate that you weren't particularly sympathetic to private investors building new homes.
Well, yeah. So yeah, abundance. I think there is a split on the left. I guess I'll just say it up front, very critical of abundance. I think that the solutions they offer to the housing crisis, um, and just generally the abundance argument generally, right, which is about deregulating housing, deregulating zoning, deregulating environmental, regulations, which California did with SECA, as a way to speed up building, right? Um, and it's a market-based solution. I think there can be market-based solutions, but they need to happen alongside other solutions. The market itself can never solve the housing crisis because it's never going to be profitable enough to build the kind of housing we need, which is like deeply affordable low-income housing. And that housing is just essentially not profitable for developers, right? That's why what we've seen is a glut of luxury housing that has been built over the past 15 years. It's not that we haven't been building housing. It's just all the housing that's been built has been luxury housing. Because
when you say a glut, are you suggesting no one's living in it?
Yeah, in New York City, there's vacancy, there's luxury vacancies all over the place. There's like entire skyscrapers empty, half full,
But they, I mean, again, I'm no great fan of these things, but on the other hand, you use the word glut suggests some sort of economic problem. I mean, these homes, if they are homes, or these places are being bought often by people who live outside the US and just keeping them empty because they can afford to.
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, they're investment properties. In some cases, people are washing money, right, with luxury real estate. I mean, the question we should be asking ourselves is like, is that where we should be spending our resources? Is that going to solve the housing crisis? No, none of that is going to solve the housing crisis, right? But that's what the market has offered us so far. And so what I'm trying to say is when we only focus on market-based solutions, this is where we end up, right? And I think the Ezra Klein, my other issue with the Ezra Klein, Derek Thompson abundance, right, is I just don't think that changing housing regulations and speeding up permits and stuff like that is a big enough picture solution for the crisis we're facing, right? And my other issue with abundance is that I think they, in some ways, misunderstand the roots of the housing crisis, right? They assume that the housing crisis is a lack of housing. And when you assume that the housing crisis is a lack of housing, then your solution is to build more housing, right? I say that the housing crisis is not just a lack of housing, it's also a lack of regulation on the kinds of housing we already have, right? And that if you think about a solution for that, then you look at things like rent control or building social housing, right? If you look at the actual numbers of vacant homes in the United States, there are 15 million vacant homes in the United States, right?
Yeah, but it's because of, and I've had this discussion on my tech show this week with Keith Tier, who talks about the abundancy of land in America. Most people don't want to live in South Dakota or where there's lots of free land. Everybody wants, again, it's partly cultural, partly economic. People want to live in San Francisco or Manhattan or Washington, D.C.
Yeah, sure. So there's a mismatch between where those vacant houses are and where people want to live. And California does have like one of the lowest vacancy rates for housing, but I think it does matter that there's so many vacant units still, right? Because we would never suggest that, oh, there's vacant units, well, maybe homeless people could live in them, right? That's not a solution we would ever think because that is like messes with our fundamental, values of private property.
Manissa, how's Governor Newsom doing? He's pretty much implicitly at least announced that he's going to run for president. He's ending his term as California governor. He's talked a lot about what he has and hasn't achieved on the housing front in California. What's your take on his record?
So, Newsom has fully adopted, I think, the abundance doctrine. there have been, like I said, he rolled back California's landmark environmental laws so that housing could be built more quickly. He's set state mandates on the amount of housing that cities need to build. So I think it's hard to say yet how much that will work to solve the housing crisis. Housing, honestly gets built slowly. Even if you roll back all the regulations, you still have to build it, and you still want to build it well, ideally. And, under
Well, there's more and
conditions.
more talk of new homes being built in faster and faster ways using materials that are easy to put up and to use a Silicon Valley term, scalable.
Sure. So we'll see. I mean, so far every year that there's been this mandated housing from Newsom coming from the state level, San Francisco has not met its targets. In particular, it hasn't met its targets for low-income housing. It has managed to meet its targets for luxury housing, but not for low-income housing. I wish Newsom did something like support this bill that I mentioned in terms of capping rents in the state. I think that would address the housing crisis, but we'll see I think we have to see how much this sort of like deregulating, speeding up zoning, speeding up, permits, changing zoning, how much it works. Yet to see that, because it will take, I think, about 5 years to see if that sort of does.
Are there other states that are more models for this? I mean, you're on the East Coast. You've studied state policy on homelessness, on home building, on evictions. Are there states that are doing a better job than California?
That's a good question. I've been so much focused on California. I don't think right now there are states that are doing a better job. I don't think anyone's doing a particularly good job. This has reached a federal level. Elizabeth Warren just proposed, sort of capping some of the incentives that private, industry and private equity, uses to buy up housing, right? So the conversation about the financialization of rental housing has reached a federal level at this point. Trump himself, just a few days ago, proposed limiting the amount of units that private investors can own. Right. We're at a point in this country where last year, I think in 2024, 2025, investment companies bought up 25% of the housing on the market. Right. And so, this has reached a federal level where, even Trump is saying like, well, is that the way? Is that who we should be selling housing to? Right. Most of the housing they buy up is starter homes. Right. Which makes it increasingly unaffordable for people to, buy their first home.
And of course, it's probably symptomatic of all this that America has a real estate president. Manissa, as I said, I interviewed Patrick Markey a couple of months ago. I'm sure you're familiar with his work. Is there a connection between what he calls homelessness, formal homelessness or people sleeping on each other's couches, and your arguments in Anti-Eviction? Is the fight against tech-led gentrification in San Francisco, this fight that you chronicle, were the homeless involved, or is homelessness and the homelessness community, are they different categories?
Yeah, it's a good question. The people who I, interviewed and worked with for this book, many of them said that, if we are evicted from our apartment, we don't have anywhere to go. We will be homeless or effectively like couch surfing or, showering at a gym and sleeping in their office kind of homelessness, right? So in my mind, the two things have to be connected, right? What happens when, people who are evicted from their, in San Francisco, from their rent-controlled apartments and have nowhere to go and, basically had to choose between keeping their job in San Francisco and being homeless or couch surfing or something like that, or being displaced like out of the region entirely, right? Most of the people who I worked with for this book said that they couldn't afford anywhere in the whole city and pretty much the whole Bay Area. that they would be, displaced to a whole new region, and then they would need a job there, right? So it's like, well, do I choose my job and homelessness in San Francisco? And many people chose that because they're like, well, this is where my livelihood is. This is where my community is. So I'd rather try to find a way to stay here, even if that means being effectively homeless. So yes, I see a deep connection between the two things.
In terms of the community that you studied, I think a lot of people would assume that the typical, perhaps, kind of person who's going to be affected by this is the new precarious class, an Uber driver. In terms of this fight against gentrification in San Francisco, was it led by this new class of gig workers, or was it more teachers and policemen and firemen and the typical kind of 20th century work?
It was, so most of the people, now that I, as I think it through, one of the main characters in my book is a teacher in the San Francisco public school district. Another person was a paraprofessional also in the San Francisco public school system. There was a bartender, a nurse, a freelancer, but like a copy editor sort of freelancer, right? So these are less the sort of like gig economy, I think, maybe partially because of the timing of it, and more, people who had careers and, livelihoods that they thought of as relatively stable. And housing, again, like I said, that they thought of as relatively stable, and were, trying to build pretty stable middle class, not rich, lower middle class lives for themselves.
The subtitle of your book is The Fight Against Tech-Led Gentrification in San Francisco. Gentrification is a controversial world, and of course, nobody seems to like tech much these days. Is tech-led gentrification worse than gentrification? Does it make any difference where the gentrification is coming from, whether it's from Wall Street or biotech or the internet or AI? Is there something particularly, in your view, problematic about tech-led gentrification, or is it just symbolic of our 2020s economy?
It's a good question. So two things, right? The book uses tech-led gentrification just because it is so much about this particular moment in San Francisco, where the tech economy was everything. I mean, you live in San Francisco, so you know that San Francisco sort of now lives on this boom and bust cycle with the tech economy, right? When tech is doing well, San Francisco is doing well, which is something. And when tech is doing badly, you end up in, a quote unquote doom loop, right? So I say tech-led to sort of describe what's happening in San Francisco, but I also say tech-led because I wanted to talk about some of the particular contours of the tech industry that were leading to, particular kinds of gentrification in the city, right? And so, which activists were sort of pointing to, right? There was like, we've become a company town for the tech industry, right? And they're critical of the ways that the city's, prosperity was tied to that, right? And the way the city sort of rolled out a red carpet for the tech industry. Something people often talked about was the Twitter tax break zone in downtown San Francisco, right? Where Twitter was given a huge tax break to put its headquarters there, right? And then people immediately started being evicted in the surrounding areas, right? And so they're really critical of the way that the city was sort of like trying to really court tech to come and headquarter themselves in the city, which, then had problems when, Twitter decides to move a lot of people or fire a lot of people, right, under Musk.
Some local people might say, well, San Francisco's always been a boom bust town. It was founded on the gold rush, and ever since then, whether it's financial services or the internet or AI, there's always been this boom and bust. And in a way, I'm guessing the kind of people who participated in the anti-eviction movement here were better off during the busts than the boom days. Is that fair?
I mean, yeah, I agree. San Francisco has always been a boom and bust town, right?
the railway boom, of course, of the late
Mhm.
19th century, of Leyland Stanford and the other tycoons who built the city.
Right, the sort of, like, World War II boom where the city was the, center of, like, shipbuilding and wartime not just the city, but the whole, region, the center of, like, wartime industry, right? Shipbuilding, armaments for World War II, etcetera. Yeah, sure, but, I think the critique of that is within a boom and bust framework, right? How do you provide, your sort of like working class citizens, your teachers, right? Your bartenders,
Mm.
some level of stability, right? To keep the city going, whether there is a boom or a bust, Um,
Yeah, it's certainly one of the great tragedies of San Francisco. As you say, the people who make the city livable, I mean, firemen, policemen, teachers, it's an impossible place to live. As I mentioned, we ran The Yellow Vest and the Battle for Democracy by Ida Sousa about the rebellion of the Yellow Vests against Macron's France. We had that conversation actually recently on the show. Is what you're arguing in Anti-Eviction, the fight for tech-led gentrification in San Francisco, is the fight a model for how to address so much of what's happening in our economy? I know you've written extensively also on the Occupy movement. Is it a kind of Occupy 2.0 in a sense?
yeah, the organizing I write about in this book sort of did in a lot of ways emerge from the Occupy movement. So at the tail end of the Occupy movement, a lot of these activists found themselves actually like moving their friends every weekend out of the city who are being evicted and then turned their sort of activism to um the housing movement in the city. And San Francisco also has a long history of housing activism, which is why they have such strong rent control laws, right? Which has made it possible for some kinds of people to stay in the city for as long as they have, and keep organizing for more rent control and more protections, right? um so, and I think I hope one of the contributions of the book is, in this moment of, hopelessness, around what we can do to, change any of the many authoritarian, tendencies, um, is a little bit of like examples of like the way that a small group of dedicated people really came together, built a community amongst themselves, combated some of the deep alienation eviction makes people feel, and then fought for each other to stay in their homes, and how it worked, right? How some of these people still live in those places. They still have that community. So, I feel depressed politically right now, honestly.
You're probably not alone then.
But, as I was kind of looking through the book, I was like, yeah, it's good to have examples of things that have worked, of people who come together, of how change can happen. How can we have how we can have ideas that are bigger than what are on offer right now, right? Sometimes I joke that if there's anything to learn from the Trump administration, it's that maybe we should just maybe on the left, we should also be thinking bigger and, you know, stop worrying about like, oh, maybe this policy would solve this thing, but just think bigger overall, right? What would it look
I
like
don't
to
think
do it
that's a
next?
joke. I think that's a serious observation. Finally, Manissa, as I said, your book, the subtitle is "The Fight Against Tech-Led Gentrification in San Francisco." As we speak, the tech-led gentrification here is very
Mhm.
much bound up with AI. The two leading private AI companies, both have offices in San Francisco,
Yeah,
Anthropic and OpenAI.
yeah,
And they're driving real estate prices up. I'm sure they're resulting in even more evictions than there have been historically. Anthropic's CEO, Dario Amodei, has been quite outspoken in terms of his concern over AI. So he seems a reasonably decent guy. I mean, even Sam Altman has his moments of decency. What can the tech community do here? Should Altman at OpenAI or Amadai at Anthropic, guys who are really shaping or reshaping San Francisco, do they have a responsibility in terms of all this? I mean, they have a responsibility in the sense that they want happy workers, and not everyone who works at these companies are millionaires. So they have problems of living, and they also have people who work in their canteens and drive their cars and clean their offices. What should the tech community be doing here? Or what would you like the tech community to be doing? Because tech still, in my view at least, or at least the people I know in tech, tends to shift to the left. They may not be on the hard left, but there's certainly, most people here aren't great fans of Donald Trump or MAGA. What could the tech community be doing in terms of addressing the question of gentrification and of eviction and homelessness?
Yeah, I think there is a lot to do. I mean, one of the first things I used to we got this question a lot in the 2010s also when we were organizing. And one of the first things we said is like, well, we keep telling you there's an eviction crisis. So like organize with us to like, we have policies that we're trying to pass at the state level, like feel free to organize with us. Feel free to, come into our meetings. Feel free to learn about the policies that we're trying to push. Feel free to learn about the lives of people who have like been here for a long time and their ideas for what the city should be. I think one of the critiques, to sort of loop back to the colonization argument, one of the critiques people often had was, which I think is a critique we could still talk about, is that the tech industry often thinks that they know better than everyone, right? That they have the solutions for everything, right? And that the solutions are always technological solutions for everything. But actually there's like housing organizers who've been working in San Francisco for decades and decades who have ideas about like what the city needs, what sort of policies could be enacted to help keep working people in their homes, and doing some of that, like listening and then like appreciating and like working with, building those sorts of bridges, I think is something that I heard a lot from housing organizers, is like, we're not anti-tech. We just want them to also like see where we're coming from, to listen to us, to work with us, and also like pay their fair share for being in the city. Right.
Well, there you have it. If Sam Altman or Dario Amadane, you guys,
Sure.
if they're watching this, Manissa Maharawal, the author of Anti-Eviction, says, get involved, come to some of the meetings. An important issue, certainly one that everyone in San Francisco is all too familiar with, for better or worse. Anti-Eviction, the fight against tech-led gentrification in San Francisco. Manissa Maharawal, thank you so much, and congratulations on the new book, Anti-Eviction.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Hi, this is Andrew again. Thank you so much for listening or watching the show. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe. We're on Substack, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, all the platforms. And I'd be very curious as to your comments as well on what you think of the show, how it can be improved, and the kinds of guests that you would enjoy hearing or listening to in future. Thank you again.